Pretty basic audit stuff. So let's start. We've got section 5. Fraud prevention is our overall one of which of the 4 sections we're in. This is, I guess, chapter 5. I don't know what to call the things, but anyway, auditors' responsibilities related to fraud. All right. So we got some Sarbanes-Oxley talk again, this time related to the auditor. So every other time we've talked about Sarbanes this semester, it's been from the point of view of the CEO, the CFO, and those guys, the company, right? So now we're shifting our focus on what does Sarbanes require of the auditor. We haven't talked about that yet, believe it or not. So here we go. The audit firm has to register with the PCAOB. I don't see that as a test question, but we need the information there. Work papers have to be maintained for 7 years. That's a rule. Firms must have a second partner review. PCAOB does inspections every 3 years or every year if it's a big audit firm auditing more than 100 public companies. And the most important on this slide for sure is the auditor reports to the audit committee, not to management. All right, that's the thing. So yeah, I mean, it's good information. I don't know about test questions on it other than that last bullet point maybe, but you never know. The Private Securities Litigation Reform Act says, among other things, that each audit of a public company must include procedures for detecting illegal acts that would have a direct effect on the financial statements. See, that's the thing about auditors. You know, our responsibility for fraud really ties into the fact that fraud leads to misstatements, and that's really what we're after, right? Procedures for identifying related party transactions, because there's a big risk there, right? And then evaluation of going concern. And I don't know how important this slide would be for test questions, but you never know. Now we get into the stuff where the big test questions probably will come from. So the audit standards related to fraud. So we take a risk-based approach to auditing. We begin the audit with a risk assessment, and then we go from there. Right? This, you know, you just sit there and you talk. You kind of brainstorm. You know, you have some familiarity with what is going on, and you're saying, hey, that's a risky area right there. They could manipulate things there. We need to look closely there. So you begin with a risk assessment and then select the particular areas of focus based on the level of risk. The auditor will plan and perform the audit, and this is just the same old language you've heard over and over in all the audit classes. Plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether financial statements are free from material misstatement, whether caused by error or fraud. You should know that by heart. You should memorize that. I mean, you probably already know it by heart and can say it right now back to me. Reasonable assurance, not certainty. That's a good test question. That's easy. You know, anytime you have a test question saying that you're trying to guarantee that you find something, or without any doubt at all find something, or look for every single error or something, that's wrong. All right, it's not possible. We just have reasonable assurance about, and they're just saying whether the financial statements are free from material misstatement, and those material misstatements could be caused by error or fraud. We need to find them regardless of what they're caused by. Communicating about possible fraud. You know, we're auditors here in this little section. If we are looking and finding potential fraud, what are we going to communicate? We bring it to the appropriate attention, or I'm sorry, the attention of the appropriate level of management. Even if that matter might be somewhat inconsequential on the grand scheme of things, if it's fraud, it's really not inconsequential. All right. And this second bullet point is really important too. Don't go telling stuff about this outside of the company where you're not supposed to be telling it. You'll get yourself in trouble and you'll violate ethical obligations and things. So disclosure of possible fraud to other parties outside of management or those in charge of governance of the business is not an auditor responsibility. Not only that, you might get in trouble for doing it. So keep it to the people who need to know about it. Don't go to the cops. You know, that's a lot of the ways the test questions will word things like that. You know, true or false, I should take this to the appropriate level of law enforcement. No, it's not what you do. Okay. Audit of internal control over financial reporting. So, you know, this is a very specific area of audit. You're looking for the internal controls and seeing if they're doing what they should do. For some reason, they like to stress in test questions that this audit of internal control should definitely be integrated within the audit of the regular financial statements. That's a better deal, so you should do that. You should use what they refer to as a top-down approach in your thought process, not necessarily in the audit procedures as you start carrying them out. But what they mean by this is you begin at the financial statement level and the understanding of just the broad overall risks, then focus in more specific on entity level controls, and then start focusing in on and down to significant accounts and disclosures. That's what they say to do. You must specifically evaluate controls enacted to address management's override of controls. So if you wanted to stress something here, it's management's override of controls. Because a problem is that management can sometimes override those internal controls. So you got to look out for that. You got to evaluate that. And then finally, with a note on this, there's a lot of material here that you will have already gotten a really good grasp on with basic audit stuff. All right, not even in-depth audit stuff at all, just very basic stuff. Read through and confirm, make notes as necessary, but you're probably good to go if you remember a little bit from audit. But based on what you were telling me a second ago, you might need to look a little harder. You don't like the audit stuff, so. But no, it's very basic stuff. So, so that's it for that section. This is easy section. Not nearly as easy though as this next one, and it's easy because there's just not much there. The section here is called Fraud Prevention Programs. I don't know what to say about this other than you may not get any questions from this section at all. If you do, it'll be so obvious that you'll love it. So that's about all I know to say on this. It's just an oddball section. I had trouble making notes about, ooh, that's good. It's just kind of, yeah, that's obvious. That's kind of where I was at on that one. What I did note, again, this isn't worth much, but I needed a slide at least. Actually, this first bullet point, that's probably a guaranteed test question, honestly. The best tool you have against, in preventing fraud is to increase the perception of detection, to make them think they're going to get caught. Then they'll get scared and they won't do it. That is a good test question. And they'll even go so far as to say that is the #1 most important thing to do. So increasing the perception of detection. That's always the right answer if that's an answer choice, unless it says the opposite of it or something. Which of these is not true, then it would be something other than that. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, that's important. Then they go into just some proactive things you can do to kind of nip fraud in the bud a little bit. Surprise audits, if they know they're coming, they'll be scared and they'll be like, well, they might get us with this surprise audit, so let's act right. Anti-fraud education. I think I said long ago, anything that talks about educating or training somebody, everybody on everything, that's always a good thing, right? Questioning, fraud assessment questioning, just being out there in the open and upfront and just make this a part of the environment. Just knowing that you're looking for it and you're going to be asking about it and you're going to be doing analytical reviews to fancy data crunching to find things. Just these are proactive things you can do. All right, and then they talk a bit about having a written anti-fraud policy with some pretty good detailed things, written code of ethics, written code of conduct. It's good to have things in writing. That way, if you're having to take legal action against somebody, you've got kind of a leg to stand on. You know, if it's not written in there, then how are you going to get them in trouble for it? You know, you're a lot better off saying, hey, look at this policy that we have. You violated that right there. Then you got them, right? That's all I got from this section. It's a good skippable section if you're in a bind. All right. This section is called fraud risk assessment. So this is specifically about the whole idea that we talked about at the beginning of class, where you are assessing risk. Then after that, you're going to focus your attention on the risky areas, right? So digging deeper into that, what is fraud risk? There's some good stuff in this little chapter. There's some good testable things. Fraud risk, it's just a definition, is the vulnerability, the risk, right, that an organization faces from people that are capable of combining all three elements of the triangle. Cressy, remember? You know that fraud triangle. That's a big deal. So what are they again? Pressures that drives them to want to commit fraud, opportunity that gives them the ability to commit fraud, and then rationalization of what they've done. That's the fraud triangle. So fraud risk is the risk that all of that's available or exists. All right. So definitions, good test questions. Inherent risk and residual risk. Pay attention to these because they'll give you both of these definitions, and then they're going to tie it into an important point. So inherent risk is something that's just there. Y'all know what inherent means. So it's risks that are there before management kind of takes any action to deal with it. All right, residual risk is what's going to be left over after management takes some kind of action. So the risk is there, management takes action, there's going to be a little risk left over. Our objective of any controls that we're putting in place is to make residual risk small. We don't want there to be much of that there. They say, and they kind of make this a little more wordy and confusing than it should be, they say they want to make residual risk significantly smaller than the inherent risk. That's too much. Why don't you just say residual risk, making it small? That's what we want to do. All right, so keep those definitions ready. Fraud risk assessment. So we're, again, trying to be proactive here. We're not wanting to be reacting to a problem. We want to keep a problem from happening. So we're assessing the risk and putting things in place to keep it from happening, right? So it's a process aimed at proactively identifying and addressing. The point in identifying, if you don't address it, vulnerabilities to fraud, whether from inside or outside. So identify the risk, prioritize them, and then that'll drive actions to start managing those risks. That's what it's all about here. All right. There's a lot of stuff here. It seems kind of like, whoa, that's a lot of big words with indexes and quotients thrown at the end. But honestly, the name tells you what it is. So this is not that hard. So the whole deal is a fraud risk index. So the whole index is about an overall assessment of fraud risk based on three different things. There's an environmental risk. We know what an environment is, so we don't have to memorize the definition here. There's a culture quotient. We know what culture is, so we don't really have to memorize something here. And then there's a prevent detect index. So I would say be familiar with the fact that there is something called a fraud risk index, and there's the three things. And I'd probably stop at that because you'll know what those are, right? Look at it. Environmental risk index. That is environmental things. They call it macro level, wide environment things. Risk indicators like pressures on the business, that's an environment thing. The system of internal controls within the business, that's the environment. The tone at the top by top management or whatever, right? That's an environment. All right. Culture quotient is going to be an assessment of how, behavior, how the organization and its people behave or are perceived to behave. And they drop down and add three little terms into that tolerance, entitlement, and notification. They're all indexes. But again, don't have to memorize definitions here. Tolerance is index is just their tolerance of bad behavior. You're just kind of getting in there and saying they seem really tolerant of bad things going on. That's the tolerance index. Entitlement is an assessment of how they kind of display a sense of entitlement to things. Notification index is how likely they will be to come forward if they find something wrong. So it's all about the culture. And then the prevent detect index is the quality of their mechanisms to prevent and detect. So all that seems really complex, but really it's not that bad. It's all together. It's a fraud risk index. It's made up of those three things. Responding to residual fraud risk. So we have inherent risk. We put controls in place to mitigate those. We got some risk left over. How do we respond to what's there that we can't get rid of? There's 4 things, and these are good little test questions too. So pay a little close attention to this. You can avoid the risk, which is just make it disappear, not in a really good way, right? It'd be like, oh man, I'm afraid somebody's going to steal that inventory. Let's just stop selling that. That would be an example, an extreme example of avoiding a risk. But that's really it, discontinuing an activity. This is a risky thing to do. There's too many people who are wanting to do it and steal it from us. Let's just stop. That's avoiding the risk. That's a response to residual risk. Stop fooling with it. You could transfer the risk. You can get insurance. And that puts the risk on the insurance company. It costs you money to do it, but that's a response to the risk. You can mitigate it, try to figure out prevention and detection that you can continue, add on top of what's already there. Or you can just say, let's roll the dice. Don't do anything else and just assume the risk. That may be, there's maybe a cost benefit consideration there. I could buy insurance, but that's expensive. Let's just gamble on this. And maybe nobody will do anything wrong and it'll be fine. You just kind of assuming the risk yourself. If, you'd have to assess whether it's probable or improbable that something will occur. And if it does, how much loss are you going to incur? All right. And the big chunk of this chapter is something that you could probably not worry with. I didn't update those page numbers. They may not be quite matched up to what's in your current edition, but probably very close if not. But they have a little, again, this is a reference text that we have, where it's not meant to be read cover to cover. So a big chunk, half of that chapter that we're looking at has a fraud risk assessment tool that a company can use. We're studying this to take a test. We're not studying this to right now put this in practice. So there's 15 modules in there. They give you a little program to follow, a series of questions to help an organization kind of zero in on some area of risk. It's a good outline of things that should be done or sometimes things you shouldn't do. It might be worth skimming through, take note of something that wasn't already obvious to you, but it's pretty obvious stuff. So if you're in a rush and want to skip something, that's probably skippable too. And that's it. It's easy stuff right here. All right, so fraud risk management, not a whole lot to deal with here. And just really by way of introductions on the slides, COSO is the organization, it's the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, I think. They're the ones who developed a lot of this stuff. And then they mentioned this other guidance a little bit. None of that matters for the exam. The highlights of this chapter, though, on fraud risk management What is it meant to do? What are you doing? Well, you're working to do these three things. You're working to hopefully, ideally, prevent fraud, right? This is a proactive approach where you're identifying risks, you're responding to those risks, you're putting policies in place, you're putting controls in place, keep it from happening. That's great, right? You want to do that. But you can't catch everything and prevent everything, rather. So a fraud risk management system will also need things in place to detect fraud. So that's going to catch what happens if and when it does happen, hopefully quickly, so you can respond to it. And that's the third thing, responding to fraud. So fraud happens, investigate it, punish somebody, whether it be in-house or get legal on it, and then fix the problem, right? Address whatever control weakness led to that problem even happening in the first place. So that, in a nutshell, is what fraud risk management is: preventing, detecting fraud, and responding to any fraud that occurs and fixing it, right? So that's a highlight of this chapter. Another hotspot is really going to be who does what. You got the board of directors. They're not day-to-day people. They are broad oversight people. They are all about overall strategies and that kind of thing. And the audit committee is a subgroup of the board that's going to specifically oversee the accounting matters and the auditing matters. We've talked enough about audit committee during the semester. Senior management is going to be the day-to-day stuff, and they're going to make sure there are adequate internal controls in place. They are very, very importantly going to have a good, positive, moral tone at the top. That's a phrase you'll see a lot. Good tone at the top. They'll say arguably that's one of the most important things. I don't guess arguably it is one of the most important things. The whole environment that they're setting. And I guess if there's any potentially tricky question they might throw at you, we're so used to in audit class and whatnot talking about management has, they're responsible for this and that. Watch out for trickier questions where, really when it comes to managing these risks, everybody at every level has responsibility. All right. So, be aware of that. If you have an answer choice where they're talking about something really broad, like just managing fraud risk, that's going to be everybody at every level are going to be ultimately responsible for that. And that's that section. All right. So, and then it wraps up, and honestly, again, it's a reference manual that we're studying from here. They close things out with ethics. They talk about ethics across about 8 pages, ethics for fraud examiners. And then they give us the actual code of professional ethics that the ACFE has, and then professional standards as well. Good reference. I have put into one slide what I feel like the questions you would get here would be really obvious, probably. Maybe not as obvious, and that's why I put them on this slide here, and probably hot spots for questions. So definitely this first bullet point, I could pretty much promise you'll get this question, and we've mentioned it probably 3 or 4 times. As a fraud examiner, do not give an opinion regarding guilt or innocence of any person. But bullet point 2 might lead you in the wrong path if you're just thinking no opinion on any of this. All right, so bullet point 2, it is okay in an interview setting to accuse somebody. Where it's wrong is if you're communicating these accusations to a third party. All right, so don't express any opinion to somebody on this person's guilty, this person's innocent. But if you're one-on-one with them in an interview, you can accuse them. Just don't accuse, don't communicate those accusations to a third party. You don't want to express any opinion on guilt or innocence. While we're on the whole topic of giving opinions, do not give an opinion as a fraud examiner. Don't give an attestation type opinion where you might say something like, in our opinion, this organization is free of material fraud. Don't do that. That is not proper. So you would never want to do that. And then a couple other randoms. Fraud examiner is not prohibited from, the whole conflict of interest thing. They can do examinations on companies they have an interest in. The key thing about any conflict of interest really is they have to disclose it. All right, but fraud examiner, they can pretty much do kind of whatever for the most part. Definitely disclose it. So if you get any questions about this person is a fraud examiner and they have an interest in this company, they absolutely should not accept an engagement. That's not true. They can. If you get a question, it's like they have this interest, they accepted the engagement, but they didn't disclose it. That's not a good thing, right? You shouldn't do that, obviously, right? And then another hot spot for these ethics chapters about confidential information. And this goes back to stuff we've talked about already too in earlier sections. Dealing with confidential information, don't tell stuff. All right, that's pretty much it, unless you have consent to tell it. It's no longer confidential if they say, go ahead and tell it, right? Or if there's some kind of court order, then you're kind of required to do it, right? So if there's a kind of a warrant or some subpoena or something like that, then you got to comply with the law, right? So confidential information, don't tell it unless consent or court order. That's pretty easy to remember. And that's it. We're done.